afternoon.
Hi, Mr. Nolan.
Yeah.
This is Ari Armstrong out in Colorado.
Yeah, hi, Ari. How are you?
I'm doing fine. I thought I'd talk to you about the LP's 30th.
Okay.
Now, I'm on speakerphone because I thought I'd tape record it. Is that all right?
That's okay. Let me get the note the message you sent me, which I did print out because I thought that might help me track along. And I tell you what, I'm going to put you on speakerphone, too. I don't know if that'll mess up the quality of the sound at your end, but you can tell me as long as it's still good enough for you to hear and record.
Okay.
Okay? Alrighty, I found it. This is the memo you sent me on Saturday, August 11th. So I've got your list of questions. I suspect we're not going to proceed in an entirely linear fashion, but...
Right.
Where do you want to start?
Well, let's start. There's some controversy as to where and when the LP was actually founded, so I thought you could explain that.
What is the nature of the controversy as you have heard it? I'm just curious what misinformation has emerged lately, because it seems to pop up every few years and we have to bat it down again.
Well, basically, there's a debate over whether it was founded in Westminster or down in Colorado Springs.
Well, technically it was founded in Colorado Springs. The initial planning meetings were the first couple of meetings at which we discussed forming the party and, scratched our heads and decided we needed to find out if there was any support for the idea. Those occurred at my home in Westminster, where I was living at the time.
Okay.
And interestingly enough, the city council in Westminster 5 years ago, I guess it was the city council, passed a resolution. Somebody had tipped them off, and they made that officially commemorate the founding of the Libertarian Party in their city. I guess not a lot happens in Westminster, and they wanted to be on record as having had something important happen there.
Yeah, I remember that. I actually live in Westminster, so.
What?
I actually live in Westminster, so I've heard that.
Okay. I was amused to find that out. Somebody in Denver, or somebody in the Denver area sent me a clipping about that. However, actually, the meeting, what happened was as the summer and fall progressed, we added a couple people from Colorado Springs to our initial core group, so to speak, and we started having some of the meetings down there, and the meeting at which we actually officially voted to form the party was in Colorado Springs. It was at the home of a gentleman named Luke Zell, Z-E-L-L. I believe he is now deceased.
L-U-C-K? I mean L-U-K-E?
Luke, L-U-K-E.
Okay.
As in, Matthew, Mark, Luke,
right.
etc. And he lived in Colorado Springs, and he was our first life member, gave us $100, which in 1971 was worth more than it is today.
Well, do you know what was the official date of that?
December 11th.
Okay.
I'll go back on the regular phone. Obviously, this speaker-to-speaker thing isn't working real well. Okay. December 11th, 1971 is the actual official birth date of the Libertarian Party.
Okay. So, what are the events that led up to the founding of the LP, and why was it specifically in Colorado? Was that just because that's where a number of you live?
To answer the second question first, yes. What triggered my concern, and at the time, in 1970 and 71, I had been fairly active in the Young Republicans, starting with the Goldwater campaign in 1964, which was when I was in school. And I stayed semi-active in the YRs through the years that followed up till 1971. Now, as you may remember, or you probably don't, since you were born that same year, but as you may have heard, on August 15th, 1971, President Richard Nixon went on television and decreed wage and price controls, which was the first time that had ever been done during peacetime in American history. And we were technically in peacetime. The police action or military action in Vietnam was never officially declared as a war. It was totally unconstitutional, of course. So we had a first peacetime imposition of wage price controls, plus taking the U.S. off the last vestiges of the gold standard. We had been off the gold standard since 1933 or 34 in terms of Americans' ability to redeem their dollars for gold. But the dollar was still pegged to gold for international transactions, which naturally added put kind of a bit of a brake on their ability to inflate. So the governments always want to remove any impediments to their inflating the money supply ad infinitum. And Nixon basically said, well, we're tired of being on the gold standard. We don't want that thing standing in our way. So as of now, the U.S. dollar is no longer redeemable in gold anywhere, anytime, anyhow. And we all know how much inflation we saw in the 70s. So those 2 points, which he made in that same speech on August 15th, were the impetus for those of us who'd been thinking about it. We'd had a couple of meetings before that. That was either our second or third meeting, happened to fall on the day of Nixon's speech. And, of course, we didn't know when we set our meeting a week or 2 or 3 in advance that was going to happen. But we were sitting around in my living room in Westminster on August 15th, and who should come on but Richard Nixon? I guess it had been announced that he was coming on to make an important announcement. And that was the announcement that he made, and we looked at each other and said, well, that settles it. If there was ever any doubt as to whether we need a party that stands for some kind of real limited government and individual freedom, then this should settle it for us.
Right. In addition to Mr. Zell, who else was around back then?
Okay, the initial, it's getting so long without looking at my notes, I'll have to scratch my head a little bit. That may sound stupid because it wasn't a very large group. Incidentally, would you be so kind as to send me an electronic transcript of the article to review? Not that I'm going to try to censor you or anything, but just to make sure that if I've gotten anything wrong or to give me a chance to correct any minor errors that might creep in.
Yeah, of course. And I will edit it in terms of just text.
Right, I'm just kind of talking off the cuff to give you the information. You're going to have to sift through it and organize it and present it in the most logical fashion.
Yeah,
I understand, having been a newsletter editor and newspaper editor and so forth for much of my life, so I know how that goes. Back to the immediate question. The original group of 5 was myself, my then wife, Susan, who I have lost track of. She got remarried after we broke up, but still lives in the Denver area. But she dropped completely out of any activity in the Libertarian Party. A gentleman named Hugh Futch, Futch, who lives up in Bailey, or at least did until a few years ago, out in the mountains. I guess it's not as far out in the mountains as it was 30 years ago. Civilization has crept out, and he's surrounded by civilization now, which probably doesn't please him. He's kind of a wild-eyed mountain man type. A college student named Dale Nelson, who disappeared shortly thereafter and has never been heard from again. And a fellow named John James, who was a young, at that time, architect who lived in Denver and was our first candidate for U.S. Congress in, I believe, either 1972 or 1974, there in the Denver area. Those were the original 5. We were soon joined, so to speak, or had connected. John James had a half-brother named Pip, P-I-P-P, Boyles, B-O-Y-L-S or B-O-Y-L-E-S, in Colorado Springs. And he contacted Pip, who was a like-minded person. They were both very much into Ayn Rand and the whole objectivist movement at the time. And Pip had 2 more friends down there, Eric Westling, W-E-S-T-L-I-N-G, and Luke Zell. And we had grown to 8 by the time we took the vote, so to speak, and formally decided that we were going to go ahead with the party. The criteria we had set was that we were going to contact libertarians and free market-minded people around the country throughout the period. On August 15th, we decided we were going to see if there was anybody else that felt the way we did. So we sent out letters. I had a couple of mailing lists. One was a list of people that had bought bumper stickers and buttons from me over the last several years. I've been running ads in the back of libertarian publications, or what there were in those days, little newsletters and so forth. I also had the mailing list. I had several small mailing lists, and a couple of the other people did too, I think. So we sent out some mailings to people around the country that we thought might be reasonable prospects, people who might feel the same way that we did that the time had come to form a new party. And our criterion was, if we got 100 positive responses, 100 people saying, count me in, by the end of the year, that we would go ahead and do it. And we had meetings every month to review results and talk over new ideas and new plans and feedback that we'd gotten from people around the country, which was all pretty positive. So we met again in September and October and November. And by December, we had over 100 respondents. So we said, we're going to do it. And we voted that evening, December 11th, to form the party and held a press conference early in January of 1972 to announce this fact to the world, and got a surprisingly large amount of press coverage, probably more than it deserved, and it probably gave us more encouragement than it should have. And we thought, wow, the world's ready for this. I'm not sure the world was ready for that 30 years ago. It may not still be quite ready, but we got a surprising amount of press coverage out of that first press conference in January.
Cool. Did you know Gail Norton, or was she after your time?
Gail Norton joined the party. I think she was actually an official member. In fact, I know she was because she was a delegate to the 1979 convention. To quickly answer your second question, no, she wasn't before my time. I didn't leave Colorado until 15 years ago, 1986, and Gail was active in like 1978, 1979. And Gail happened to become involved because she was close friends with a woman named Mary Louise Hanson, often generally just called ML for her initials. And ML Hanson was maybe even a vice president, but she had some kind of role down at the First National Bank of Denver, and she was the national vice chair of the party. And she was very gung-ho libertarian in those days, the late 70s, and so she recruited a lot of her women, businesswomen friends to at least come to some of our events and hear our speakers and learn about the party. And Gail was one of those. And Gail's kind of a quiet, reserved, studious kind of person, not real outgoing, pleasant enough from my recollection, but not a real outgoing, person. Kind of quiet and reserved, and she came to a number of the meetings, and I remember having at least a couple of conversations with her, and she seemed pretty sincere in her devotion to libertarian ideas, at least in the broad sense. Now, I understand that after I left Colorado, she got, picked up by the Republicans. They sensed that she was a promising young woman, because she's bright and so forth. And I guess they ran her for, Attorney General, and she served a term or two as that. And at that time, I've been told, she worked to try to keep us off the ballot and worked to try to hinder the Libertarian Party in its growth.
I was not aware of that.
That you would be better off to verify that with somebody who's been around for a long time. One such person, obviously, would be Dave Atkin. Right. Another would be Paul Grant. Do you know Paul, or do you know who he is?
I know both of them.
Okay, yeah, they can fill you in more on what Gail Norton did after leaving the Libertarian Party and joining the Republican Party in, I guess, the late 80s or early 90s. And, of course, we all know she's Secretary of the Interior now, and I hope she can do some good there. I don't know how much good you can do in a appointed position like that with all the bureaucracy, but I'm sure her sentiments or her instincts are to push for, changes in the right direction, at least to some degree. I don't think she would push for the kinds of radical change or fundamental change that many of us would like to see in terms of privatizing federally held lands and so forth. But I think she will try to work at least for, the right kinds of things on some scale as Secretary of the Interior.
Okay. I've heard that in New York in the late 60s and early 70s, there were actually meetings about the formation of a party.
Well, that was on your list of things here, and I see you're just going down the list you sent me, which is fine. As far as I know, that is not true, and I'm not saying you've been misled. I think what people are at a distance tending to forget things, and that could happen. It could even happen to me. I was not at any such meeting in New York. My understanding is that there were several meetings of libertarian and anarchist and objectivist, a whole spectrum of people who could generally be called libertarians, at least in the broad sense, met a couple of times in New York in that period, 1969, 1970. As far as I know, none of those meetings was specifically for the purpose of thinking about or discussing the formation of a new party. It's entirely possible that someone or more than one someone spoke at one or both of those events and threw that idea out for consideration. I can't rule that out because I wasn't there. But there was no specific, as far as I know, there was no specific meeting ever called in New York in 1969 or 1970 to discuss the formation of a new party.
Okay. Well, what about the big names like Rothbard? When did they...
Rothbard was very active at those meetings. He was a participant in those meetings.
Okay. And
Rothbard was very against, there's somebody coming to the door. It's the mailman. I got to sign for a letter.
Okay.
Hold on for a minute?
Yeah, sure.
Testing.
Sorry about that. That was a package I've been waiting for.
No problem. Okay, so Rothbard became...
Rothbard, in fact, there were some fairly lengthy descriptions, as I recollect, of those gatherings in Rothbard's newsletter that he used to publish way back in the 60s and 70s and on, I guess, into the early 80s. And he eventually got tired of publishing it. I've even forgotten what it was called. I've got back copies buried in the attic somewhere. It was called Libertarian something or other.
So what was his relationship with the LP after it got formed?
He was not supportive for the first year or two. In fact, he ran an article in his newsletter in about in 1972. That would have been the right time frame. Basically saying this was a silly idea and the time had not come and we'd be wasting our time and blah, 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 blah. But by, say, 1974, he'd done a complete 180, something Rothbard was well known for doing over his life on every conceivable issue. I don't know if you know much about Murray Rothbard. He was a very interesting character, very bright guy, very, very colorful, very garrulous. I liked Murray a lot, but he was more driven by personality things, but by people's personalities. He got into a lot of battles over his life with a lot of people. He was notorious for having had friendships or alliances with various people, and then a year or 2 or 5 years later, having a falling out with them, and becoming very bitter and denouncing them in all kinds of terrible terms and so forth. He went from being an opponent of the party in its earliest days to being a strong supporter of the party. In fact, he was on the platform committee every convention for years on end into the mid or late 1980s, and then he had a falling out and he became bitterly anti, if not the party, at least many of its leaders in the latter years of his life. He died 5 or 6 years ago now.
Okay. Now,
very interesting guy. I always got along well with him, but a lot of people didn't.
Yeah, that's my impression. Okay, when the party moved to Washington, D.C.,
the first time or the second time?
Oh, I didn't know there were 2 times. But I heard that that caused a little bit of animosity among some people in Colorado. Is that true, or what happened exactly?
I don't really care to speculate on that. I can give you some of the chronology. After the 1974 convention in Dallas, Texas, Ed Crane, now head of the Cato Institute, was elected chair of the party. And one of the points he had run on in his campaign for chair was he did not feel it was appropriate to move the party to Washington, D.C., because that would just make us part of the problem, so to speak. That once you move to Washington, D.C., you're enmeshed in the system, and trying to maintain our independence and our radical stance and our separation from our ability to critique the political system without being corrupted by it. I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically said, no, we should not move the office to Washington, D.C. His opponent, a young fellow named Eric Scott Royce, who lived in the Washington, D.C. area, had campaigned on a platform consisting in part of a proposal that the party should be moved to Washington, D.C. And I think that was partly because he felt it was where a national party should be headquartered, and partly because he lived there and he thought that would be a better place to have it. Well, Crane won by a pretty good margin. The party's headquarters was moved from Denver to San Francisco, which is where Crane lived, and they rented an office out there. And after about a year, in about 1975 or 1976, Crane did an about-face and said, yes, the party should be in Washington, D.C. And they picked up and moved the party to Washington, D.C. Well, a lot of people felt they had been deceived or betrayed. Now, off the record, and this is off the record, I could give you a very, very long list of people who have been deceived and betrayed by Ed Crane. But that's not what we're talking about here. Okay. So I'll go back on the record. That's just an aside that if you talk to a lot of people who were around the Libertarian movement in the 70s, you will find that Ed Crane lied to everybody he could, every time he could, if it was to his own advantage to do that. The party was in Washington, D.C. for, 2, 3, 4 years. Then we had after another one of the elections, the headquarters was moved to either Dallas or Houston. I think Houston, because whoever we had elected chair, and I don't have all my notes in front of me. You don't want to go into all this, probably. Right. But it was moved to Houston, Texas for 2, 3, 4 years. And then it was moved back, and it's been there ever since. So the loose chronology is Denver, San Francisco, D.C., Houston, back to D.C. But it's been back in D.C. now for, probably 14, 15 years.
Right, okay. Well, that's good enough. Okay, when you moved...
And it probably is the right place for the headquarters to be at this point. I don't want to get into the pros and cons of whether it should or shouldn't have been moved at various times, but it's where it is now, and it's probably where it should be, and I have no doubt it's where it's going to stay. So it's kind of almost not worth going into, is all I'm saying. If you want to, you might just note that after starting in Colorado, that the party headquarters was relocated several times, and has been in Washington D.C. for. I could get you the year if you wanted, but it's got to be almost half of its 30-year existence by now.
Okay. Well, just so you know, I'm going to do a cut for our newsletter. I also mentioned to the California people that they might want to cut.
Okay.
And then National might too. So is it okay if I send the longer version to them after, of course, you check it over?
Sure, you can do that, but I'm just suggesting we not get into all the party conflicts and all the stuff about the battles over relocating the headquarters, because nobody cares at this point.
I agree. Okay, so when you went to California in '86?
I left Colorado just about exactly 15 years ago, in late September or early October of 1986. Spent a little over a year in the Atlanta, Georgia area. Had hated it there. I won't go into all the reasons why. And moved to California at the beginning of 1988. So I've been here almost 14 years.
Okay. And were you active in the LP throughout that time, or did you take some time off?
I off and on. I have taken various brief vacations, but I've always been at least peripherally involved in terms of going to national conventions. This is probably a historical fact that's of mild interest to somebody. As far as I know, I am one of only 2 people who has been to every national convention since the very first one, and the other one is Ed Clark, who was our presidential candidate in 1980. And Ed and I are the only 2 left who've been to every single one of the national conventions.
Wow. Okay, so let's.
And both of us keep joking we can't miss one until the other one does. So.
Hopefully that'll be a long time. Well, let's move out of the history and sort of into expectations. What have been the LP's biggest successes, in your opinion?
That's a good question. They obviously have not been in the political arena at the presidential level. I don't know if you were able to locate that article from magazine.
I read it.
Yeah. I think there are people are sort of mesmerized by the glamour of the presidential race, and they think, "Ooh, we can get our ideas into the national political arena, by having a presidential candidate who will speak forthrightly and eloquently, and will get all this great media coverage." Well, by and large, it has not been particularly successful because to participate meaningfully at the presidential level, you've got to have a lot more name recognition or a lot more money or a lot larger support base. You need at least 2 of those things, of those 3 things. And we've never really been competitive at that level. So that's not the proper gauge to use in measuring our success. I think our successes have been in several areas. First of all, in building by far the nation's and probably the world's largest network of freedom-minded individuals who've been able to collaborate with each other and inform each other on a whole range of issues and work on, particular issues, form, coalitions and committees and action groups on all kinds of issues, ranging from Second Amendment rights to fighting censorship to trying to repeal the drug war, which we haven't done yet. But and that is, we've created this network of freedom-minded stumbling over my words today, freedom-minded individuals who have been, able to work with varying degrees of success on a lot of issues. And I think that's very important. If it weren't for the Libertarian Party, I don't see any way that network would have come into existence. We have certainly popularized the word libertarian and what it means and brought it to the American people. We have helped bring about the change that I predicted would come when I wrote my article on political systems 30 years ago, that the debate has largely shifted from the old left-right debate it's still there, but it's fading, to a much more fundamental debate, which I would call the libertarian versus authoritarian debate, which is what most of the public dialogue in this country is about now. It's not always labeled as such, but that's what it has become, because the liberal and conservative positions have become more and more indistinguishable. A year 2001 Republican, with rare exceptions like Ron Paul, is indistinguishable from a 1970s or 60s or 70s Democrat. The Republicans are basically just out there passing more laws, grabbing more money, spending it on their projects and giving it to their friends. There really is no significant difference, in my estimation, between Republicans and Democrats, and we are the only credible alternative. We are seeing a realignment of the political axis or political spectrum, which would be typified by us on one end, the Greens on the other, and the Republicans and Democrats sort of mushing together more and more into a big lump in the middle. And we are helping to redefine the political spectrum and hold up the standard at one end. Because if we weren't there, there'd be nobody else holding up the pro-freedom position. Right. So those two things, building the network and helping redefine the political system and make sure that the pro-freedom, pro-individual rights position is accurately and articulately represented, I think are our two major contributions. Now, you get down to the nuts and bolts level, libertarians have been very instrumental, not always working as the Libertarian Party. Again, this is the importance of that network building, in doing things like opposing local tax increases, bond issues. I know in Denver you fought things like the light rail thing and the stadium thing, and I don't know what all, with varying degrees of success. Richard Ryder down in San Diego has been very successful. He's regarded, all the media always come to him immediately. He's the man as far as leading the battle against the assault on the taxpayer's pocketbook. And Ryder and the people that he has organized, all of them libertarians, have over the last decade saved something like $12 billion.
Wow.
In the city of San Diego alone. I'm making that number up. If you want Ryder's email, I can give it to you, and I'm sure he'd be glad to give you some specifics on the things they've been able to accomplish. I'm most familiar with what they're doing down there because where I live, Orange County, California, is midway between L.A. and San Diego. So I'm about equally familiar with what goes on in both of those cities, and San Diego is certainly the largest and best organized city or county Libertarian Party in America. If the San Diego Libertarian Party split off from California and became a separate state party, the San Diego Libertarian Party were a state party, it would be one of the 10 largest.
Oh, I didn't know that.
They've got over 1,000 registered dues-paying libertarians and dues-paid members of the party in the city and county of San Diego, which is pretty impressive considering that although San Diego is a big city, it's not New York or L.A. Right. It's about the third the size. It's got about 3 million people versus 8 or 9 million in New York and L.A. So, for a city that's a third the size of the two biggest cities, it's got a very large, very well-organized Libertarian Party. We've been much more successful at the city and county level, obviously, in terms of leading or opposing initiatives, running candidates and getting them onto city councils, into public offices. We've had a fair amount of success, at least in terms of vote totals and in affecting the debate at the congressional level. And you get above that, and with rare exceptions, our success starts to turn into failure or becomes less successful. Our efforts are less and less successful as you move up the ladder of partisan politics. Let's put it that way.
What were your expectations for the LP back in 1971? And then how the party evolved, diverged from what you thought would happen?
Well, I suppose like a lot of very optimistic young people, and I was 28 at the time, we had hopes, maybe expectations is too strong a word, but we certainly had hopes that we were going to become a major party, maybe not one of the major parties, maybe not replacing the Republican or Democratic Party, but become a major party in the sense of having the balance of power and being able to strongly influence the political debate and act as a swing vote within, like by 1980. And, of course, that didn't quite happen.
Well, all right. I've counted about 4 different theories that libertarians have in terms of what's going to happen. So
At least.
I thought I would get your comments on at least those big 4. How likely do you think it is that the LP will become a major political party, as you just described, or even to replace one of the other 2 parties, probably the Republican Party?
Okay, I'm looking at this is your question here with the A, B, C, D, E choices?
Yeah, roughly.
Yeah, okay. That's a good question, and since my crystal ball hasn't been real accurate in the past, I hate to go very far out on the limb, but let me give you a couple of thoughts on that general topic, and then if those spark any specific questions beyond that, we can explore them. You probably read or heard that I have been for a number of years espousing the theory, which I do hold, that political change in the United States, in fact probably in most countries, but certainly in the United States, which is the country I know most about, having lived here all my life, or almost all my life, moves in a cyclical pattern. In the United States there seems to be a fairly strong political cycle of about 72 years. Have you heard about all that?
Yeah, I heard
with the 72-year cycle theory that I've talked up at various conferences?
Right, yeah.
Okay. And that is due to culminate in 2004. Now, I don't believe it's like, clockwork, and, that's got to be the year.
Right.
It could be 2008. I would still bet on 2004 as being the most likely year for there to be a major realignment of the political system in this country. And by major realignment, I mean that the die will be cast for pretty much determining the general nature of our political system and therefore our social system to a large degree for the next 72-year cycle. In other words, there are times of great change and great opportunity, and there are times where things just sort of trundle along the way they've been going. The society settles into a new equilibrium. And I think we are fast approaching one of those. And at that juncture, now only a little over 3 years away in terms of the election, I think it's very likely that the people of the United States are going to have to choose between a more freedom and a lot more freedom and a lot less freedom. I think the system we have now, the mixed system that we have now, is unstable and falling apart. That it's not solving. Most people are aware that it's not working very well, and are therefore looking for, at least on an unconscious level, some kind of change. The problem is that most people don't really know what kind of change they want, and a lot of them that don't want the kind of change that we want. But I still think we're in one of those periods of major change in decision-making, a crossroads, as it were. And therefore, the question becomes, which way are we going to go, and what is the mechanism whereby we're going to choose the direction that we take? And I think the Libertarian Party can and will play a major role in that decision. The question, of course, becomes the details. Specifically, how is that going to happen, and which direction is more likely? I have to say that I think the odds are still against us. We're still fighting an uphill battle. I think, and I don't like to have to say this, but I think the odds are more likely that America will slide into a sort of, fascism with a sort of kinder, gentler fascism, by which I mean kinder and gentler than Mussolini's, but not much. I think it's more likely by, say, 60 to 65%, nearly two-thirds, somewhere between, greater than 50-50, probably perhaps as high as 2 to 1, that we will go in the wrong direction, because there's so much force behind the move in that direction. There are so many powerful, organized, entrenched special interests that are collaborating or reinforcing one another. The two major parties, the media, the unions, the public school system, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of forces arrayed against us that have a vested interest in maintaining and expanding the statist system we now live under and making it worse, in the sense that we're all going to be carrying national ID cards. Just for the first time when I was on vacation last month, maybe the second time, but only recently have I had to show a driver's license or an ID when checking into a hotel. Never had to do that before. You didn't even have to show one to get on an airplane 10 years ago. Yeah. Now you have to show some kind of, quote, government-issued ID to check into some hotels. I don't know if that's a result of state law, but or whether it's just that it's part of the national paranoia that's creeping up. But we are living more and more in a surveillance state. We are living more and more in a state where people are, and by state I don't mean Colorado, I mean the state in the classic, sense of the word, where you are innocent, you're no longer innocent until proven guilty. That's still the presumption on paper, but in reality, we operate in a system whereby you are guilty until you can prove yourself innocent. In terms of when you were accused of violating the drug laws, not paying what the government thinks you ought to be paying them in taxes, et cetera, et cetera. More and more we were living in a state where it's presumed that the government controls everything and you have to get its permission to do anything. And I see that trend as having accelerated, particularly here in California, in the last decade. The question is, can we halt that and turn it around, restore a greater degree of privacy, make sure we have the right to keep and bear arms for self-defense, repeal these ridiculous drug laws. Any form of criminal possession laws, of course, are tailor-made for a police state because all they got to do is plant the evidence on you. There's a lot of very ominous trends. On the other hand, there are some good trends, one of which is the fact that the Libertarian Party exists, is growing, it isn't growing in a completely linear fashion. I understand national membership is down slightly this year, as it is usually after the presidential year, the year following the presidential year. We are starting to attract more and more attention. We have more credibility. We have more members. We get more coverage. We get more people elected to office. We're being taken seriously. If we did not exist, I think the battle would be hopeless. And that probably harks back to the question you asked earlier about greatest success. Our greatest success is that we have created the only viable mechanism now existing to offer a reasonable hope of stopping the imposition of a very authoritarian system in this country that might last for generations. We are the last best hope for freedom in America. I really do sincerely believe that. And if we did not exist, I can't see anybody else around who'd be likely to be fulfilling that role. Can you?
Nope.
No, I mean, there are people who are good on certain issues. You've got the gun rights people, and you've got the people fighting on the various issues, the drug war, and people fighting the drug war, and people fighting the attempts to take away our guns, and people fighting for privacy, and so on and so on. But they're all one-issue groups, and they don't collaborate with each other. In fact, they're somewhat suspicious of each other in some cases. Your liberal ACLU types who are good on things like censorship tend to be, very hostile to Second Amendment types, even though they're supposedly there to defend the Bill of Rights. Their position is, well, we defend 9 out of 10 articles. That's pretty good, isn't it? They defend every item in the Bill of Rights except the Second Amendment. And when you ask them about it, and I have, they say, well, that the Second Amendment confers a collective right, to organize militias. That is a right that says that the states have a right to organize militias. That amendment doesn't pertain to individuals. That's their official position, which is why they're very bad on defending one of the key provisions in the Bill of Rights, which has always mystified me, except that if you know the origin of the ACLU, way back in the 20s, it was originally started by communists and socialists, specifically to defend communists and socialist types who were being perhaps wrongly harassed by the government for speaking out and advocating leftist political ideas. And it's good that we have the ACLU, their motives notwithstanding, but their heart has never really been in defending the rights of the individual to call for less government. They're just not really, that's not really where they're at. They are really a civil liberties union whose notion of civil liberties is very skewed to the left. And that's not to slam them or say that they're a bad organization. On balance, they're a good organization and more of an ally than an adversary. However, you got to keep that in mind, and that's why the ACLU by itself is never going to be a significant force for liberty in the broad sense in America. The same is true of groups like the NRA. The NRA is great on its one narrow issue. I won't say it's great. They're pretty good. They've gotten worse and worse over the years, which is why we now have Gun Owners of America and Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms and Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership and all these other groups that are doing what the NRA should be doing, just as we have the LP doing what the Republican Party should be doing.
Right.
And you're probably familiar with a lot of those groups.
Right.
But all of the gun rights groups, well, I won't say all of the gun rights groups, the NRA, which is the largest, is good on gun rights most of the time, but I've seen editorials in their magazines saying we need to prosecute the drug war more ferociously because these nasty, evil druggies are destroying America. They don't get it. A lot of them. They don't see that it's all one package. That if you give the government, if you give federal agents the power and the legitimacy to bash down people's doors to look for drugs, well, what's to stop them from bashing down people's doors to look for guns? They're not getting it. Now, some of them individually do, but the organization is totally in the pocket of the Republican Party and has been maybe forever. Just as the ACLU is really almost a front group for liberal Democrats, the NRA is in many ways a front group for conservative Republicans. The old joke about NRA stands for National Republican Auxiliary. There's a lot of truth to that.
I hadn't heard that, but that's funny.
But it's true. Like all snide remarks like that, there's always an element of truth to them. So the LP is the only organization in the political arena that is consistently supporting the idea of individual rights, limited government, extremely limited government, absolute strict interpretation of the Bill of Rights on every point, repealing taxes, ending the drug war, completely defending our right to keep and bear arms with no ifs, ands, or buts, none of this wussy stuff like, well, maybe there should be background checks and fingerprints and nah. But no, we have a right to own the means of self-defense, period. Until you lose it by committing a felony, sure, convicted felons, fine. Now you've put it in the case where the right is presumed and you can lose it if you do something felonious, not, well, you only have the right to the extent that the government grants it.
Right. Well, let's be optimistic for a minute and say the LP is going to be successful.
Okay.
Is it more likely that it becomes a major political party in its own right, or that the Republicans start losing so much that they adopt many of our ideas? Like a lot of libertarians draw a parallel to what happened in the Socialist Party.
That's a real interesting question. And if you excuse me when I could keep cutting you off because I've got a cough today. I don't know why. Some kind of post-nasal drip, and I don't want to blow your eardrum out, particularly if you're on speakerphone. So if the phone goes silent for a moment, it's because I'm coughing and have covered the mouthpiece.
Okay.
That could go either way, and that's always been a question we've faced from the earliest days, to hark back to the point you raised about, well, what was our hope or expectation way back 30 years ago. Where did we see the party going? Some people maintained from the beginning that as soon as we began to be a significant presence on the political scene and started achieving an impact on elections, that the Republicans would scurry back to the pro-freedom side of the fence and become a lot more consistent. I would like to believe that, but the evidence has been to the contrary, that over the last 30 years, the Republicans have gotten steadily worse. What has Bush done, aside from appoint Gail Norton and Lynn Scarlett, that would give you any cause for optimism that Bush and the Republicans...
Okay, I'm back.
Oh, good. Bush and the Republican Party, as far as I can see, offer no reasonable hope. In fact, they've been getting worse. And the likelihood that they will steal our ideas is one that, you have mixed feelings about. Like, well, hey, those are our ideas. Why should you steal them and get all the credit for them? And on another level, a sort of surreptitious hope that, gee, it would be nice if they would actually adopt some of our ideas and put them into practice. And even if, we didn't get credit for them, they'd be changes for the good, and we'd like to see them in our lifetime. I haven't seen much evidence that they're likely to do that. The excuse that the Bush administration has been giving is, well, you got to get things through Congress, and that's always difficult, and it's compromise, and blah, 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 especially since Jeffords switched and you now have a democratically controlled Senate. But that's simply not true. Witness the fact that they had an opportunity to do something very significant that required no approval or participation from Congress, and that was to kill those medical reporting requirements that Clinton put through in the waning days of his presidency by declaration. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
Where the Clinton administration decreed that as of some certain date, and I think it's January 1, 2002. I don't know, but some date in the fairly near future, basically all your medical records become essentially the property of the government.
Right.
And the government can demand, they won't store them all in a central repository, at least not at first, but the government basically will, the federal government and presumably eventually the state government, will have access to everybody's medical records all the time. And of course that means the insurance companies will too. They are effectively putting in a significant chunk of the apparatus that's necessary to nationalize healthcare, and there's another form of population control, literally the power of life and death over people eventually. And they just decreed that. That was never passed as a law. They just passed that, they just decreed that as an administrative decree. It was scheduled to go into effect. All Bush had to do was to tell Thompson, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, kill that, don't do it. There were tens of thousands of people sent in letters and petitions urging them to kill it, and they let it stand. Now, tell me this is the action or the behavior of a pro-freedom, individual rights president. Here was a case where he didn't have to fight Congress, he didn't have to do anything except simply reverse an administrative decree by the previous president who was a Democrat, and he did not. That, to me, is clearest evidence there is no real functional difference between Republicans and Democrats. As a lot of people have pointed out, there was a greater break in terms of policy between Reagan and Bush the first than there was between Bush and Clinton. There was at least some attempt to scale back government and rein it in under Reagan, not nearly as much as we would like to have seen, but there were a few faltering steps in that direction. So you can really look at the 8 years of Reagan as almost kind of like an anomaly in modern political history, and you can speak of the Reagan years, and then you have to talk about the Bush-Clinton-Bush years, the Bush sandwich with that ham Clinton in the middle. There's no fundamental difference. Bush is not going to do anything remotely libertarian as president because when he's had opportunities to do so, he hasn't. The great majority of Republicans, elected Republicans in the Congress, their hot-button issues are the social conservative issues. They're not that concerned about taxes. In fact, Republicans were busy piling on, adding their favorite pork barrel projects to the last appropriations bill. Right. With the exception of Ron Paul and perhaps one or two others, they're just a different breed of porker than the Democrats. And socially conservative ones whose form of political correctness is different than that of the Democrats, So, I can't really see any reasonable prospect that either of the major parties is going to co-opt our ideas. If we had been getting 10 or 15% of the vote in national elections, as some of us had hoped way back when we started, you can bet they would be, because that would be a huge swing vote that they would need to capture. Or even in the congressional elections, if we were regularly getting double-digit figures, we would be a political force to be reckoned with in the immediate sense, and they would be saying, boy, there's that huge vote block up for grabs. The great majority of elections, presidential elections, are settled by less than 10%. They aren't as close as this last one, but you go back and look, there are not very many landslide elections. So 10%, or better yet, 15%, would make you the balance of power. You don't have to be a majority. You don't even have to be close to a majority to have tremendous, political influence, to be a balance of power, to have the balance of power, and therefore be able to call the shots in a lot of areas where you can swing votes one way or the other. We haven't achieved that level of influence, and so the question becomes: can we? If we can't do that, can we become a major party? You'd think that would be, one of the stops on the way to becoming a major party. However, if you follow the theory of what is sometimes called catastrophic change, to sudden and unpredicted change, where pressures build up within a system, whether it's a physical system or an economic system or a political system, you have sudden change as you did in the Soviet Union in 1989. I think it is possible that under the right circumstances, that a charismatic and well-known candidate or candidates could be elected president as a libertarian in 2004 or 2008, or could at the very least throw the political system into realignment and assume that we could assume that balance of power role.
Cool. Here's another issue. You've written favorably about the idea of using the drug war as our lead issue.
I believe that.
Now, but there's a potential problem with that, in that the people who are attracted to the LP because of that issue may not be sympathetic with other issues. Do you think it's likely that we win them over on other issues, or how's that going to play out?
Well, of course, that's a good point. That's always a problem with emphasizing any one particular issue too much. And the drug war certainly has that problem, as does any other issue, whether it's guns or taxes or education, or pick an issue. No matter what issue you pick as your lead issue, you're going to have people who are going to be repelled as well as people who are attracted. The reason I think the drug war is so important and needs to be our primary issue is because it impacts everything else. The war on drugs is the excuse. It's the battering ram of the state. It's the excuse that's being used to say, well, we got to be able to look at people's bank accounts. We can't have financial privacy because, people could be hiding drug money. Well, we got to take away people's guns because, after all, all that drug-caused violence. The drug war, the whole drug issue, the whole drug legalization issue has impacted every other issue, whether it's spending, whether it's financial privacy, whether it's censorship, the mandatory minimum sentences. It's the most insidious issue. It certainly shouldn't be our only issue. I think it needs to be always presented in the context of the government is too large, too powerful, too expensive, too dangerous, and the links made that you can't defend our rights to privacy, our rights to keep and bear arms, et cetera, as long as this insidious force is in effect.
Okay, in the Liberty Magazine article, you talk about the LP as being necessary in addition to, like, Cato and the single-issue groups and the educational groups like
right.
The government. So, do you have some kind of sense, how do you think resources might best be spent or developed? In other words, how important is it, should the LP get most of the resources, or should the think tanks get most of it, or how do you think that should all be divvied out, given the relative benefits of the different approaches?
My first answer will be what you could regard as a cop-out, but it isn't, and the answer is, as the individuals who dispense those resources choose. The market will decide. I can tell you where I would put my money, but I certainly wouldn't presume to say, well, of all the dollars out there and man hours and whatever other resources we've got, X percent should go to the LP, and Y percent should go to Reason and Cato, and Z percent ought to go to Gun Owners of America. I have no right. I don't have the wisdom to decide to answer that question in the broad sense. I can only look at the array of choices available at any given moment in time, and it will change from moment to moment as various issues become more important, as various groups wax and wane in their effectiveness. Any numbers I gave you or any percentages I gave you, if I were willing to do so, would be outdated next month or next year.
And presumably there's also a lot of synergy. Some groups will then feed off onto other groups.
Well, that's the next point. It's not as if there's a fixed pie. It's not as if we've got $20 million out there, that there's a $20 million budget that has been collected and is sitting in a bank account, and there's some central committee of 8 or 10 or 20 people sitting around the table, trying to budget that and saying, well, if we give $1 to Cato, it can't go to the LP, and if we give $1 to the LP, it can't go to the advocates, and so on and so on. There is no bucket of money. There is no central repository. There is no central committee. And that's the way it should be. The amount of money that's available is not a fixed amount, and there's no one person or a group of persons allocating it, and I don't believe there should be. Now, in terms of a general, broad answer, I'll give you a very, very broad answer. Having made all those qualifications, I'll give you a very broad answer and say that at the present time, let's say we've got think tanks, one-issue groups, and the LP. I would be inclined to say roughly a third each. Maybe a little less for the one-issue groups, because no one issue is that important.
Okay, that's cool.
I think that the think tanks do... I think the think tanks do a lot of good, but I don't think they do nearly as much good as they would like to have you believe. Just as, Libertarian candidates and LP activists like to oversell our importance in the role, the great scheme of things as far as bringing about change, etc. I think anybody who's in a position of having to raise funds does that. And so consequently, I think, you look at what Reason or Cato or Heartland or any of the others actually accomplish, and the picture gets a lot murkier. I mean, you can say Cato's published 7 zillion policy studies. Yeah, they have. And many of them are very good. And I sincerely wish that all the policy recommendations, or since I haven't read all of them, I shouldn't say all, but that the great majority of the policy recommendations that Cato has put forth or that Reason has put forth, I sincerely wish that those would be implemented. In fact, I wish they had been implemented long ago. I'm 100%, or at least 90%, I'm sure, behind the proposals, or in agreement with the proposals that the think tanks make. However, when you get to the question you asked about how effective has the LP been, how effective has Reason or Cato actually been? And I only cite them because they're the two biggest. There's regional ones, like Heartland, and there's dozens of those think tanks, right, policy studies groups, and most of them do good work to one degree or another. And I'm glad that we have them. But that said, okay, how many of Cato's policy recommendations have actually been picked up and passed into law and implemented into policy by, say, Congress? Because they concentrate, they're in Washington and they basically put out policy proposals that they push at Congress and the national policymakers. How many of them have actually been implemented? Not very many that I can see. There may be some, but I'm sure if there were a huge string of massive successes, that the folks at Cato would be talking about them a lot more. They'd say, look, we proposed X, and, Congressman Paul brought it to the floor, wrote up a bill to implement it, and it passed, and now, they've demolished or they've dismantled this whole huge arm of government, discontinued this program, since most of their policies are do less policies. I have to question whether, in terms of actually achieving social change, the think tanks are any more effective than the LP, and in some ways, they may even be less effective because they are trying to get the Republicans and Democrats, primarily the Republicans, to implement changes within the system. And as I said before, I think the Republicans on balance have been getting worse. So, I wish them all the luck in the world. I think they do good work. I'm glad we have all that information, all those policies.
Welcome to. Please enter your PIN. Your PIN is locked. Please contact.
God damn it! Give me a fucking break here. God damn it.
Is that?
Oh. Hello? Hello? Hello?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Man, I thought I hung up on you, but somehow it stayed on the line.
You didn't.
Excellent. Okay.
Well, good.
I'm sorry about that.
That's okay.
So at any rate, I cut
You'd be
off.
sorrier if you hung up, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
So I think that kind of answers that. It's very, very, very hard to say, well, where is a dollar spent or donated the most effective? I will say, off the record, that probably the single most effective group or organization in terms of getting the most bang for your buck long term is probably Advocates for Self-Government. If I, could wave a magic wand and say I want to increase, I have the power, sitting here and now, I have the power to increase the portion of our total resources that go to some groups, and even if it had to be at the expense of others, I would say Advocates for Self-Government probably accomplishes more with the resources they receive than any other group.
Okay. Well, that's a nice compliment for them. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your ideas about running a bunch of Congress people.
Yes.
I assume that has... I assume it's just because you have a lot more people who are a lot closer to the grassroots. Is that basically the thrust of why you think it'd be more effective?
Well, a couple of reasons. If you read my analysis of the figures in Liberty Magazine, we received, and I don't have it in front of me either, or somewhere between 7 and 9 times as many votes per congressional district at the congressional level as we did at the presidential level. We got 1.7 million votes for Congress, even though we covered only 60% of the country. If you projected that out across the whole country, you would say, well, gee, if we'd run congressional candidates in every district, we would have gotten about 3 million votes. That's a dubious projection. It could be either high or low. You could argue, well, we wouldn't have gotten 3 million because we'd already covered most of the districts where we have most of our support, because that's where we're able to find candidates and get the necessary signatures or whatever and get on the ballot. And the remaining 40% of the country is areas where we're not as well organized or well known, and our ideas aren't as popular. So to take that number and project it nationwide and say we get 3 million votes is unrealistic. It might have only been 2 to 2.5 million. That is certainly a reasonable argument. The counter argument, of course, is the synergy argument that if we'd been on the ballot in every district, we would have had that reinforcement, nationwide reinforcement. We would have been able to run, which I think we should have done anyhow, national television spots saying vote Libertarian for Congress, and then we might have gotten more than 3 million votes, because it would have increased our credibility and it would have increased our visibility and our fundraising and made it more plausible to run national TV spots, so we might have gotten 4 or 5 million votes. You're always in trouble. You're always on thin ice when you make big projections like that. But certainly the 3 million number is not ludicrous. So contrast that with the number of votes that Harry Brown got, a little under 400,000, and you're looking at about 7 to 1. If you look at the results per dollar, it becomes something more like 50 to 1. The Brown campaign and the Libertarian Party organization spent something like $3 million to get 390,000 votes, something like that. It was a little under 400. I don't know what the last final official figure was, but it was edging up towards 400. Call it 390. Do some quick math there, and you're looking at about $8 a vote, plus or minus. I mean, I don't want to get down to the penny level, but roughly $8 a vote, right? Okay. It might have been 7 and it might have been 9, but it wasn't 2 and it wasn't 100. It was roughly $8 a vote. Whereas you look at our 1.7 million votes that we got at the congressional level, I don't have figures because they were never made available, because you don't have to even file reports with the FEC unless you raise and spend $5,000. I would say our educated guess is that our 255 or 256 or however many it was congressional candidates, I would be very surprised if they spent even 1 million. Very surprised. Because as far as I know, only about a dozen raised and spent more than 5,000. I was one of those dozen. But the great majority of them ran, line holder type candidacies. They got on the ballot. They went and, did the local interviews on local TV stations and radio stations, and went to public forums and answered the questionnaires and did what they could. But probably, I would suspect that the great majority of them spent less than $1,000 per.
Why are most?
That's $150,000, and then you probably had another 100 that spent a couple $1,000. So now you're looking at maybe a total of $350,000, and then you had the top 50 who might have averaged $5,000 each. That's $250. So now we're up to about $750,000. I would suspect that was approximately the order of magnitude of what our congressional candidates altogether spent, $750,000, and they got 1.7 million votes, which works out to about 40 cents a vote versus $8 per vote at the presidential level, which means congressional campaigns are 20 times as cost effective as the presidential campaign. And I think that's because it's easier to get congressional candidates are taken more seriously. Not as seriously as we'd like them to be, but are taken far more seriously than presidential candidates for a couple of very good reasons. First off, although it's unlikely that our congressional candidates are going to win, it cannot be categorically ruled out. In other words, a newspaper editor or a TV reporter, their reaction, their instinctive reaction is not to just start rolling on the floor laughing when the candidate says, yes, I could win, given enough support and coverage and dollars. Partly because media people are ignorant. They don't really know much about the dynamics of congressional races. But the ones at the national level who cover national races know real good. They have a real good idea. They have a very good idea of what it takes and how much money you have to raise. And they look at the numbers and they go, well, gee, Bush has raised $180 million and Gore has raised $130 million and Mr. Brown, you've raised $2 million. I don't think you're a player. We can raise a proportionately greater percentage
in a congressional race. A good candidate with a good campaign team who makes a serious effort can raise $10,000. And $10,000 isn't a lot of money, but concentrated in one congressional district and allocated strategically can create a significantly greater presence in the race, enough so that our candidate can at least be the balance of power. Witness all the Republican hand-wringing over our Senate candidate in Washington, who helped to defeat Slade Gorton. We can be a player, or the party congressional candidates can be the swing vote, can be the deciding factor. Also, in many cases, or at least in some cases, our congressional candidates are people who have already gotten some kind of recognition and visibility and credibility in the area where they're running. If they're a successful businessman, or if they've run before, which many of them have, if not for Congress, for mayor or city council or school board or something, you can find a candidate who has a greater degree of recognition among the constituency than any of our presidential candidates have ever had. So we have greater name recognition, greater credibility, greater ease of getting into debates and forums, the ability to raise a greater amount of dollars proportionate to the total amount being spent in the race. All those things add up to a higher level of credibility. So I think that all helps explain the greater bang for the buck. And more importantly, the congressional races are that is the level at which, as I've said before, national issues and local activism intersect. You can address national issues in a relatively local race. Running for water commissioner is all very good, but all you get to do is talk about water. You can't really talk about the war on drugs and why we should not be in Macedonia, whereas you certainly can at the congressional level. And it's on the national issues where the Libertarian position can be most clearly delineated.
Okay, I buy it.
Good.
Okay, well, here's a minor issue, and you don't have to answer, but...
Of course I don't.
Do you have any comments about Willis, and do you think that'll have any long-term negative impacts on the party?
Barry Willis? I have not been following all that as closely as I could have and perhaps should have. I just got my latest issue of Liberty Magazine, and Bradford's still on a crusade. And, he's a strange guy. Have you ever met Bill Bradford?
Yeah.
He's kind of a strange guy, isn't he?
Well, yeah. That can be said of a lot of libertarians.
Well, yeah, and I'm not saying he's evil, but he's got this self-image of, he's sort of the crusading journalism, the muckraker. Only he concentrates too much of his muckraking within the movement as opposed to outside. That said, my wife, who is not involved in day-to-day libertarian political affairs very much at all, but she knows all the players because, she's married to me and therefore can't help but hear some of this stuff, and she's been to national conventions, and she knows most of the people that are mentioned in these articles. She knows Harry and Perry and Steve Dosbach and Bumper Hornberger, and go down the line, all the people whose names pop up in these articles. And she looked at one of Bradford's recent articles and she said, he really is kind of overwrought. He's really kind of tending to make a bigger deal out of this than probably needs to be made. And I think she's probably right. But that having been said, I think it's becoming increasingly obvious that Perry Willis is not an entirely forthcoming person. That Perry has been... can you hold 1 second? I got an incoming call.
Yeah, of course.
Still there, Harry?
Yeah.
Okay, that was a doctor. I injured my arm several months ago, and they've been diagnosing it, and they finally come to the conclusion they're going to have to do some surgery on my elbow, so I had to take that call.
Oh, sorry to hear that.
Yeah, not as sorry as I am, believe me. I think it has become evident as these events have unfolded that Perry Willis is a somewhat less than ethical person. But since he is now out of the party's day-to-day apparatus, and as far as I know, doesn't have much of anything to do with the day-to-day operations of the party, I think the impact from now on. I mean, I think it's unfortunate we've been through this, and that all these things have come to light, and that there is certainly some question as to whether the failures, to the extent that there were failures of the Brown campaign, it now becomes evident may have been due to money being diverted from more productive, from outreach to inreach, like reaching into Perry's pockets. Money going into Perry's pockets rather than to pay for advertising and outreach efforts. I don't think that was the major cause of the Brown campaign's relatively poor, somewhat disappointing showing this last time out. As they said in the Liberty article, the fundamental problem has been that we've never had a candidate who's well enough known, who's visible and credible enough going into the game that he had a chance of being a major player. But that said, I think if the Brown campaign had done certain things differently, that their goal of achieving 1 million votes might in fact have been realized. I do not think that was an unrealistic goal when Harry announced it, a little over a year ago at the National Convention. I think if they had done some things differently, notably if they had put Steve Cubby on the ticket as VP because he appealed to a whole different constituency, I think if the money had been used more effectively and more of it had been spent on outreach and less of it had been spent on paying themselves and each other, it certainly would have increased our totals quite possibly up to the 1 million level, but not much past that. So in the grand scheme of things, when people look back 100 years from now, nobody's going to be able to say, well, the reason the Libertarian Party didn't succeed, if it doesn't succeed, was because in the year 2000, or from the years 1995 through 2000, there was this man named Perry Willis who pocketed a lot of money. That's not what the historians are going to say, because that's not the truth.
Right.
I mean, that becomes the latest convenient whipping boy for, well, we haven't succeeded because, fill in the blank. The media don't like us, pick your favorite excuse. Well, the latest one may be, because Perry Willis absconded with a lot of the money. And probably Perry did abscond with some money. Abscond is too strong a word. But probably Perry Willis wound up with more of the money than he should have relative to what actual contributions he made to the success of the campaign. And it may well be that the campaign may have been more successful if Perry had not done that, but not enough so that you can say that was the critical factor or even close to it. And Perry's now shunted off to he and Harry, who seem to have a lifelong love affair, at least starting a couple years ago. I mean, they're sort of like twins now. If Harry and Perry are happy doing what they're doing and they can raise enough voluntary contributions for their new foundation, again, the market decides. If the Libertarians out there want to give money to Harry and Perry, well, then they should. I'm not going to, because I am not convinced that it's cost-effective in a pure cost-effectiveness sense of looking at, if I send $1 to effort X or group X or person X, how much will it do to advance the cause of liberty in my lifetime? The American Liberty Foundation comes up real low on the list.
Okay.
But that's my decision. Somebody else may go, cool, they're going to make and run TV spots. I'll send them $1,000. Well, fine. If you believe that, send them $1,000. I don't believe that because I've been told that story before. What we find is that 96% of the money goes into somebody's pocket and a very, very small percentage of it ever goes into actually running the TV spots, and those aren't good enough odds for me. But that's me.
Right. Well, that's pretty much the canned questions I had. Is there anything that I should have asked and didn't?
Well, looking down your list, as I look at it, I had a couple thoughts, but you seem to have covered the obvious, the past, the present, the future. The LP as a strategic option versus other alternatives like think tanks and one-issue groups. I guess we've pretty much covered it. If you would send me a first draft, and I can look at it, and I know you'll clean up all the grammatical things, and I sort of ricocheted around because I wasn't trying to be as grammatically precise and so forth as I could have been, because I know that you as a good editor will take all that verbose wandering and and turn it into crisp, succinct statements.
Right, yeah. I plan to do that. Well,